All right, here we go. Hey, y'all. I'm here with Alex again. Alex,
hi, how's it going?
For those of you that haven't listened to the other Foucault talk on the Archaeology of Knowledge, Alex, perhaps you'd like to say something about yourself for anyone just tuning into this one?
Yeah, I'm a second-year master's student at Western University, and my research is on Foucault, primarily his early stuff, and specifically the Archaeology of Knowledge. So Dave and I did a two-part podcast about the Archaeology of Knowledge, and now we're following it up with the Order of Things. So I don't know if it would be better to listen to this one first or the Archaeology of Knowledge.
I think you'd have to start.
First.
You'd have to go back and forth. You'd have to it'd be like trying. I remember in one of the courses we took on Derrida, our prof made a joke about reading Derrida and then reading Plato. Like, how do you read Plato without reading Derrida, and how do you read Derrida without reading Plato?
Sure.
It's like what comes first, but especially in the case of this, right, where so much of what he does here is readdressed in the Archaeology of Knowledge.
Right, but also the methodology or the techniques or intentions that he does in the Order of Things, he talks about those and explains them in the Archaeology of Knowledge.
Yeah, so if anyone, it's up to you.
Dealer's choice, I guess.
If you're, yeah, exactly, yeah. If you're listening to this one first, you'll probably be fine, but I don't know. If you take this really seriously, you might have to go back. But here we are with the Order of Things, nevertheless. And we were talking before starting this, not exactly sure where to start, because it's a little bit confusing, whereas we could start from the preface, but at the same time there's also an urge to jump right into Las Meninas. But at the same time we were saying that there's not that much to say about Las Meninas, so we'll just start with the preface, in which case Alex, what was it that you wanted to bring up?
Right, so one of Foucault's central topics, especially in this text I would say, but that he mobilizes in his later work, is the idea of the episteme, which is his term. He defines it as the epistemological field. I'm looking at page 22 in the preface here. Where does he say? He talks about it as the space of knowledge. In this account, what should appear are those configurations within a space of knowledge which have given rise to the diverse forms of empirical science. So it's like the epistemological conditions at any one time, and what we mean by that is, or what Foucault means by that is the conditions that determine what can become knowledge. And what counts as knowledge and what counts as pseudoscience or something of that ilk.
Yeah, absolutely. And we think, how would epistemology derive? Obviously,
there's obviously an etymological connection there between the two. One thing that I think is really interesting, and this is I would say the overriding theme of this text, is that the connections between different discourses within the same episteme are greater than the connections between two discourses that are in different epistemes. So I'll give an example. This text is in part his attempt at giving the history of three different sciences, right? So general grammar, the analysis of wealth, and natural history. So his point is that natural history, the discourse within the classical episteme, is more connected to the other discourses within the classical episteme than it is to biology, which Foucault thinks is the descendant of natural history, but also very different. So, I mean, it's hard. I can't remember the names, like the actual figures that he talks about, but someone like Darwin would be less related to the classical episteme. So even though traditional histories of ideas would want to say there's a direct evolution, if you'll pardon the pun, between natural history into biology, Foucault's point is those straightforward histories of ideas that want to see continuity and ignore discontinuity are missing a large part of the history of ideas.
Yeah, for sure. I like that. Was a good way to put that. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms, especially the distinction between two different discourses that occupy two different epistemes, even if they might be somewhat related, right? From the transition from natural history to biology.
He's definitely not saying there's no connection. Mm-hmm. He just wants to question and I'd say like undermine the lazy connection, or like the taken for granted connection that he sees a lot of intellectual historians making.
Right, and that's one of the things he brings up in the Archaeology, where he says something along the lines of, or as you corrected me last time, you said that it's not as though Foucault was just laying out a telos, right? He says in many ways this could have happened any possible way,
right?
Which is something that he wasn't perhaps quite as clear about as he could have been here.
Yeah,
where it seems as though you could read into it and say, oh, well, these are just these processes from age to age, and then you had these different things develop in accordance with the conditions of the previous episteme.
And again, like that point that he makes is in distinction from the traditional like history of ideas that would want to say, or sometimes tend to say, well, we had natural history, so that the next necessary step in the analysis of life is biology proper. Mm-hmm. There's some type of like determinism or necessity in the development of ideas.
Yeah.
Again, like we can get into this later, but within the modern episteme in particular, right? Like Foucault's criticizing that people who would want to see a teleology to history, right? So like your Hegelians or...
Yeah. For sure. And I know... I'm sorry, I'm going to bring up the Borgia thing. So in the preface, he mentions Borgia's saliva, right? He talks about that as the kind of platform from which things can come into being, or like it allows for the condition of their possibility, in a sense, as that is the base on the tongue or whatever. Right. And then from there, all things are supposed to derive, right? But it's only a condition, and that condition is contingent. Right, thinking about the episteme, how things might change across time, and how that very base changes. Where I think one of the important things to take from that is that it's not as though there's always this kind of neutral base. And from the classical age, or we look at the Renaissance or whatever the conditions were, or the discourses prevailing that time, it's not as though they all came from some kind of neutral, flat base, and they just sprouted up. And they just happen to be like a different plant, like if I were to stick with that analogy. But that even in what we often take for granted, the conception of something coming into being is not in itself neutral. It's something that abides by a certain logic, certain codes, a certain order, right? What is allowed to come into being, essentially.
Right. And again, like we can get into that a little bit more later, I think, where we might flesh it out a bit more. But I think what you're getting at is he talks about modernity as the episteme of history, right? Where I think you're right, like that. History really is the mode through which all things are viewed, right? So like, a thing is nothing more than what its history is.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
And even that idea, right? Thinking about things in terms of history, as you just said.
So like you could contrast it with like Aristotelian metaphysics, right? Where like right. The spider is being spider. Is its spiderness. It is its telos, right? So there's no history there, right? Yeah. Like it doesn't matter what the spider did a day ago.
Yeah.
That has no weight on what it's being spider today, right? And there's also no idea of like, special evolution,
right?
So there's a void of history in that model, I would say.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to mention about the episteme, just kind of like as laying a groundwork. I don't have the citation right in front of me here, but he makes it clear at one point that there's only one episteme at a time. So it's really like a macro level that determines the types of discourses that can be created or can be had.
Yeah. I have some problems with this, but we'll bring this up later.
Right. There's a lot that he's not clear about, right?
Yeah.
Or like just like doesn't address.
Yeah.
So you wanted to talk about Las Meninas?
Yeah, for sure. I was just looking here in the preface though, but like not to take this up, just how he says that. He just says in the preface how man is a contemporary invention, or it's a new invention, and that's how he ends the book. Like,
right,
I wish I could write like this.
That's the real hook.
Full circle.
That's the real hook. I think that when he was writing this, he's like, "This is what's going to move books."
Yeah,
right. Is saying that man's a recent invention.
Yeah,
which is like kind of what the book's about, but
yeah, it takes on like 1,000 other things.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit theatrical to state it like that, I think.
Yeah.
That's only part of what he's talking about in the book.
Uh-huh. So, yeah, Las Meninas. How do you pronounce it? Meninas?
That's how I've been saying it. Yeah.
No, well, in French, it's Les Suivantes, which I don't know what the significance of that would be. It'd be interesting because that means like the next, or what is to come next.
Oh, that's a lot better then, right?
Which I think there's some... See, I don't know what Meninas means, but it probably means the exact same thing.
Just like an attendant, like... what's the right word? I want to say like chambermaid, but that's not quite right. I think that's what it is.
That would make sense in the
it's like, I think it's like in the painting, the princess has all these attendants around her, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what it means.
Wow.
Or I think that's what the title is.
See, I should have looked that up before I read all this. That would have given me a different lens, or I would have had a different lens to read it with, if that was what we were getting at. But for those of you listening now, you better bring it up on Google or something, the image, if you don't know what it looks like.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's an interesting image. I would put it up on here, but I don't want copyright to poop on me.
Right.
So what is Las Meninas, Alex? What is it doing to us?
Well, maybe I'll give like a 2-second description of it because we're working in an audio format. So it's painting, and on the left side there is a big canvas. We see the painter who's kind of stepped back from the canvas, looking directly at us, the viewer. In the foreground, in the center, and on the right, there's the royal princess. There's a bunch of attendants. In the center, at the back, there's an open door with some type of gentleman looking through the door, looking straight at the viewer. And then also near the center back, there's a mirror in which we see what is the royal couple, the king and queen, in the position where the viewer is.
Right. Which is not clear immediately, and that's something that he clarifies as far as the mirror goes, right? Because on first glance, it might look like just another portrait on the wall.
Right. I think that you have to bring some context to this to know that it's the king and queen, I think. Right? Which would have been clear the time the painting was painted.
Right.
Right, but is not necessarily evident to a contemporary viewer.
Mm-hmm. Where did we go from here? There's so many things.
Where did we go from here?
What, their gaze or their...
Well,
it implicates us in a certain way, because...
So, can I ask you this?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
No, please do.
Why this painting?
Yeah. No, I didn't want to bring that down.
I have the answer, or I think he gives us the answer. He says at one point, again,
he gives a plethora of other, like Don Quixote, right? That serves his purposes like much better as far as like a literary type artsy example goes.
Right.
But I don't like. Okay. What is the answer? What is he? Why is he doing this to us?
Let me find the exact page where he says this. I can't even find it. But he says it represents representation. Right? The subject matter is representation itself, which is the character of the classical episteme.
Right.
That's the defining mode in which that episteme operates.
Yeah. And
so,
that makes sense. I guess if you're having something being drawn in a portrait,
right?
There
so
you go.
It's not like a regular portrait where the you just have a portrait of an individual.
Yeah.
Right. And it's also, I think, distinct from paintings where the painter shows themselves at work, in which you might say the subject is painting.
Yeah.
Or painterly life or something like that.
Yeah.
But the varying types of representation and viewing that happen in this painting, I think, make it distinct in that way.
Right. And yeah, absolutely. In that way, it's rather mysterious because of all the people in the image, there are 9 people in the image and a dog. Of those 9 people, 1, 2, 3, 4,
plus
5 have their gaze fixed towards us or to fix towards the royal couple, right? But of the other people, every single other one has their face cocked to one direction or other, looking at the other person, looking
or something, yeah.
In a sense. So what you get is this very circular effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, he goes into it and like draws X's between, based on people's eye lines and stuff like that. I don't know enough about art history or like art analysis to comment on any of that and like how valuable of a critique or analysis that is.
Yeah, the Fibonacci sequence type thing is as far as the Mona Lisa goes. I mean, like
the golden ratio,
the technical aspect behind the art stuff. No, I'm with you there. Right. I don't know enough of that, but there are a lot of intersections that he really focuses on, like as far as the intersection or the cross between the canvas and the guy standing at the back through the door, and then of the gaze of the people on the right, and then the mirror, and how there's that
like they intersect right in the center of the canvas or something.
Yeah, but he spent that makes sense for this to be a painting or a portrait about representation. I get it. But he spends so much time focusing on all this other stuff as well. He focuses on, the fact that they're royalty. He focuses on that, all the intersections, all the technical aspects of it that seems, if we were to just take it as being an example of representation or a representation of representation by analyzing the portrait, he goes much further than that.
Yeah.
And I'm like...
Yeah.
And then he goes and does it with Don Quixote. He's like, yeah, you can see this here as well. And it's like, well, why did we need one or the... Why did you have both? It seems as though...
Right. So I think Don Quixote for him, or Cervantes, is important because Foucault thinks he's on the threshold between 2 epistemes.
How so?
I don't know.
This is the mystery, the Foucauldian mystery.
I mean, Cervantes is doing a lot more than just representing, right?
Yeah.
So I guess he would be between like a Renaissance episteme and the classical episteme of representation. When was Don Quixote? 1500s.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're right. I don't find all of his analysis of Las Meninas or Don Quixote clear in how you apply it, or like what it says about his like macro level argument.
Right. In a sense, it feels a little bit superfluous, but I
Yeah.
don't want to say that of
No,
him.
no, certainly not. I mean, I would be interested going back and rereading it after finishing the text, and seeing like, oh, does it make much more sense now?
Yeah.
You know, or like, is the necessity of those passages much clearer now?
Yeah. And yeah, that would be especially good, having actually read the whole thing and seeing where he goes with it.
I mean, Don Quixote is really, really interesting. I mean, have you read it before? Or like,
No, I haven't. I haven't actually.
I've only read passages, but it's like very has like so many levels to it, right? In which it again like represents authorship and represents representation in a literary work.
Right.
Right. So like, if I remember correctly, like it opens with a character who is the author of Don Quixote saying to his friend, like, I don't have citations for this. And his friend's like, oh, just make them up.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes and finds a translation and like tries to track down a translator. And like there's all these different levels of representation happening. Again, it's not just a straightforward representation of Don Quixote.
Right.
So you might make a similar argument that it's another representation of representing.
Yeah. And that I guess in a sense then the method he mobilizes when thinking about Las Meninas can also be valuable. And in that way, you know, whether it be an epistemic analysis or an analysis of the episteme, we enter into kind of like a hermeneutic territory where it's like almost exegetical, right? We're digging into like a specific text, and he's sort of opening up the terrain for, you know, what he's going to do with archaeology here. It's like, how deep can I go with, like, this is how I read it, because there were moments when I'm like, okay, I don't see how this is going to be relevant, just because there's so much like that he takes up in like Las Meninas, that I don't see how he's going to string this all together. So I had that moment when I'm like, okay, let's try to think of the method here. And then, of course, after this, you know, he starts to think about archaeology and hermeneutics or whatever.
So those long, seemingly or like maybe seemingly superfluous examinations, like, is that just him doing the archaeological work on a particular text? Right?
Yeah. But then Archaeology of Knowledge Foucault would be like, see, I'd be curious to see what Archaeology of Knowledge Foucault would say specifically about his analysis of Las Meninas. Like, what perhaps, if there's anything missing, like, to what extent does he not account for let me reframe that. To what extent does his analysis of Las Meninas here perpetuate and promote the notion that there can be something kind of traced through a given cultural artifact, right? It has a telos, it has a history, it has all these connections that can be with enough rigor traced, which I feel like is something in the archaeology is like, okay, it's not that simple.
Right. And he wants to avoid that. He wants to like, right? Like the thing I always go back to is read texts or statements as monuments, not documents, right?
Yeah.
And for him, that means not coming to a text with a anticipated meaning or teleology or like meta-historical narrative that you want to fit the text into.
Yeah.
But at one point in the Archaeology of Knowledge, he says like something like, I've replaced all these other categories that we traditional intellectual history used to use, like the author, the oeuvre, or the corpus, and come up with my own categories. But like, how do I justify this? Are they any better?
Yeah.
Basically, right?
Yeah.
Like, do they actually do something novel or better in some way?
Right.
So I think I mean, with Foucault, you're always wondering, like, how much of the way that he writes is genuine and how much is, like, affectation, right? Or just, like, performance, right? So, like, does he actually think there is a risk of him performing the same type of operations that he is critiquing? Or does he just want to perform that self-analysis and like self-awareness to forestall critiques of him that he sees as like potential? That's a whole other question about like method, and you have to be careful about trying to like read someone's psyche into their texts.
Yeah, especially because we'll enter that terrain of the unconscious and stuff like that. These kind of universal reference or whatever.
Yeah,
they get to the sticky territory.
But like, I mean, I think the question's definitely there. Like, does he genuinely believe that he is susceptible to that risk? I'm not sure.
He strikes me as a person, because he says at one point, I can't remember where, but he's like, don't expect me not to change, right? Don't expect me.
Yeah, it's right at the end of the introduction to the Archaeology of Knowledge.
Right. Like, don't expect me to like hold one opinion about something, because that's not what like doing whatever this is about, right?
There's an even, or what I think is an even like more powerful, or maybe just a different iteration of that idea, where in an interview he said he wants his texts to be like fireworks or like explosions, and to like self-destruct after use. Something like that.
I'm done with this.
Well, I read that as not even more than just his own use, like after the text is written.
Yeah.
Right? It's like when he was alive, you should be asking, what's Foucault's next text? Not like, what has he just written?
Yeah.
Like, what's he going to do next?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I suggest that we talk about like the argument that he makes in this text and like the different epistemes that he draws out?
It's fine by me.
So I would say like the main topic of the text is the classical episteme, right?
Yeah.
And its iterations in the analysis of wealth, natural history, and a general grammar.
Right.
Right. And he claims that like I said, like the mode that episteme works in is representation. Right. I don't know. Did you have specific questions about that?
As far as language goes, I do. So if we, and he has that kind of odd part. He says that Hebrew retains the trace of similitude or of semblance, I guess, to a real like referent more than other languages. It says on page like 40.
Yeah. There's a. Where did it go? He said something about that. I'm again not going to be able to find the quote right away, but Hebrew words have quote fragmentary monuments of pre-Babel language.
Yeah,
which was full similitude. I mean, that caught my eye because he used the word monuments in particular.
Yeah.
But yeah, why Hebrew? I don't know. Like,
I don't know either, because like we think of the Tower of Babel, like of course we think of the Old Testament in that way, right. But no, and I was a little bit resistant to that, because I was like, okay, how is he romanticizing in a sense this kind of like this kind of originary type language? Is there a possibility of that? Of course, he's only speaking through that particular episteme, like whatever logic pervaded at that time. But now, of course, the conditions have totally changed. We think of like language proliferating endlessly and flowing through time and space or whatever. But that really stood out to me. and from there I started to think about representation and how like language develops its meaning, right? Is not necessarily being associated with a referent per se, but then you enter like his argument around sympathy and antipathy, kind of the conditions that allow for language to develop their meaning in relation to other words, as opposed to necessarily being in relation to like real thing, kind of moving through those epistemes.
So I have a quote here that might help our previous discussion of Don Quixote as well as what you were just saying. So page 47, he says, quote, Don Quixote is a negative of the Renaissance world. Writing has ceased to be the prose of the world. Resemblances and signs have dissolved their former alliance. Similitudes have become deceptive and verge upon the visionary or madness. Things will remain stubbornly within their ironic identity. They are no longer anything but what they are. Words wander off on their own, without content, without resemblance, to fill their emptiness. They are no longer the marks of things. They lie sleeping between the pages of books and covered in dust. So I think he sees the Don Quixote as bridging the Renaissance and classical epistemes, moving from an episteme, the Renaissance one, in which words were somehow still tied to their referent.
Yep.
And like you think of a lot of like religious texts, and again, like this is not my specialty, but where the appearance of a word was itself powerful and tied to its referent. And Don Quixote moves into the classical episteme in which there is that tie between referent and its word has been cut, and then that leaves the world open to all the miscommunication, misidentification, and madness that Don Quixote demonstrates.
Right.
It makes so this is like the tie back to the title, right? Like it makes the world a world of resemblances rather than a world of order in which words are tied to the things they identify.
Right. But he makes that distinction between, when he says that on page 27, he says that this is why sympathy is compensated for by its twin, antipathy. Antipathy maintains the isolation of things and prevents their assimilation. It encloses every species within its impenetrable difference and its propensity to continue being what it is. Whereas sympathy is that thing that allows things to have that similitude, that resemblance to other significations, whatever, to other forms of language that have already moved away from the terrain of the referent, of the real, of the world. But then then we're stuck in this. So okay, he says that there's almost like that this almost occurs naturally. Like this is something that pops in.
This is one of your gripes with
like
him?
In a sense, like he and a lot of my gripes are really resolved if I consider the archaeology of knowledge. But here it really seems as though he says that, okay, you have this kind of phenomenon where only things can come into being precisely by their negation of other like signifiers or whatever, other linguistic things, or by their having accepted that thing, right? And we can think of perhaps Derrida here, the différance type thing, right. Where you are not so much designated by what you are, but precisely by what you are not. Those things that you can slip away from. But I was wondering, in a sense, to what extent does something like force play a role, where there is a very calculated attempt to bring certain things into being, certain linguistic things into being.
Okay, your critique is different from what I thought you were going to say.
I mean, I'd be curious to hear what you thought I was going to say.
We can mention that later. Remind me. I don't have a good answer for you.
Because there seems to be an omission of just force or like political power.
Right. The answer might be in a different text, and I feel bad referring to another text, but it's in the beginning of what is it called? What was the one at the end of the Archaeology of Knowledge? Discourse on Language.
Yeah.
In there, I think he gives some hints. So he talks about like he expresses it in the first person, but I think what he's doing is talking about the author in general. The author's hesitance to begin a new discourse, and part of that is because of like the danger or the potential within new discourse to be disruptive.
Right.
But he really, the part of the point of that, the first half of that text is the author doesn't actually have that power. Like that is an invalid concern, because both the power to begin new discourse and what discourse can be begun is determined by the episteme. In that text in particular, I think he calls it like the cultural institutions. But like if we're thinking about the order of things in particular, we could talk about the episteme. And the danger of discourse, or the revolutionary potential in discourse, is anticipated by the episteme, or like the cultural institutions. So anything that can come into being has already been accounted for in a way, which is like, that's a very un-Foucauldian thing to say, right? Because that sounds like very deterministic.
Yeah.
But I think his point is more about like authorship, and like whatever discourse you think you begin has already been defanged by the episteme or the cultural institutions. Defanged in the sense that it doesn't pose a risk to those existing.
Right.
So you're right. There is like a force that conditions the coming to being of new discourses or reference, etc. But that force is like very diffuse and general, and it's not like in an individual person or institution or anything.
There'd be no locus of power.
No. But you're right. So he does give like a bit of an account there, or like gestures towards his account of like the creation of new reference or new discourses like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that answer?
Yeah. No, for sure. Because it so much of me just wants to think of the possibility of like resistance, but obviously like where there's
this is what I've been working on recently, actually.
Because
not satisfactorily.
Because it seems then, if we accept like what you said, which I think is exactly what he's doing, or what he would say, it's that we can only ever see these things occurring retroactively.
Right.
And we don't know when.
He does specifically say at one point, I don't remember if it's in the order of things or somewhere else, but you can't really see or understand the episteme that you're in currently. Yeah. Right? So you don't have that type of self-reflective ability. Mm-hmm.
How do you explain water to a fish or something like that?
Right, exactly. Like, the episteme not only conditions the possibilities of new discourse or new knowledge, but like the way we think is conditioned by those, right? So like in like the modern episteme thinking historically, like you can't like step outside the structures of your thought.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way, right?
So, and that's what he says, like in that same lecture you mentioned there, when he says that, it's all very Hegelian, and even every attempt we try to get out of the Hegelian dialectic, like perhaps that's just another way that Hegel has foreseen this possibility, right? Where by negating it, you are therefore thrown back into it, right?
Right. I always think of this is a bit of a tangent, but Karl Popper has a critique of those type of logics. So he talks about like Marxism, Darwinism, and Freudian psychology or psychoanalysis as just those type of logics where they can subsume anything that would attempt to contradict them or negate them.
Right.
Right.
I get suspicious of those. Those are
yeah, no, exactly. He's exactly suspicious of them and writes of them in an attempt to reject them.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if he rejects Darwinism. I don't think he would be able to go that far as like a historian of science, but he's definitely suspicious of the logic, right? Like he has his text on the open society, right, where he's writing against.
Yeah.
I guess he's writing against National Socialism, maybe.
So as far as language goes, what he states is that language was never to be anything more than a particular case of representation for the classics or of signification for us. What do you think of that shift, right? What is the difference between representation and signification for you? If you could just point back to the text
I don't know.
Because for me, reading this the first time, I was like, I use those terms interchangeably all the time.
No, I don't think he gives a satisfactory differentiation. And some of the secondary stuff I've read about Foucault has made just that critique, right?
Has it?
Yeah, just like he doesn't explain what he thinks the difference is.
Yeah.
And he uses that distinction to make a distinction, or like he thinks it's an important distinction between modes, but he doesn't I don't think he gives an answer at all.
No. And like I was trying to humor him, and I'd think, okay, what is the most basic
what were the two? Representation and presentation?
Represent and signification.
Signification.
Like, what is the closest liaison I can think between like a thing in the world and the thing that represents it? And I was gonna like kind of try to think about that as being representation, but I would say like, if I saw a tree, I would draw a tree, and that'd be pretty close.
Right.
But then signification, that's a sign.
Same thing. Yeah. I was gonna say maybe signification allows like a greater level of abstraction, right? So like a chemical atomic number or something, or like an atomic like on the periodic table of elements, as like signification but not representation. Like there's that doesn't represent, AU doesn't represent gold. It signifies gold, but it doesn't attempt to create a likeness.
See whereas the image of something, the drawing of a tree would
But I don't know. I'm not sold on that.
No, but I don't know. Then we enter into the whole, like, this is a little further on. We think of taxonomia or mathesis, right? Where it's like, okay, well, then how does thinking about things in terms of like trees, or all trees in terms of the term tree that is supposed to represent trees, but trees vary so widely between different species of trees that it seems almost absurd to say that, like, okay, tree is all things that grow out like above 5 feet out of the ground. Like, it seems odd to then say that. So it seems like in a sense we've gone into this kind of hyper representation, even though, he says we're into signification or whatever. Like, it seems like we've simplified things to a max, right? Especially if we consider the different taxonomic type brackets or whatever that we've discovered through the age there. Oh my god. The Linnaeus or whatever.
Linnaeus, right?
Linnaeus stage.
Natural history.
Oh god. It seems odd that we'd still. So, and this is another thing. I'm like, okay, to what extent, Foucault, are we to actually take what you say, like, consider it and be like, oh, this is a real thing that's occurring? Because it seems to me as though there were all these attempts, in a sense, to give names to everything, to bring everything into fruition, to give it that, enter it into the taxonomic type sphere.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like, we like things easy, like easily digestible and whatnot. But we can put that on the back burner if you wish, because I know he addresses that to some extent. But I don't know the difference between signification and representation.
Yeah. No, I would just say again that I don't think he gives a satisfactory answer at all.
No. I don't know. For anyone listening, if you know the answer, please leave it in the... But those are the terms we have. I don't know what they are in French. I guess they would be the same.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the connotation would be different in French. What a guy. Why did he... But we digress. We can, unless there's anything more you wanted to say about that.
No, I don't really have any other thoughts on that in particular.
You wanted to jump to specifically?
I had a quote here somewhere that I thought might be helpful, but I've lost it. If this is not skipping over too much, I thought we might just talk about the shift that he sees from the classical episteme to the modern one.
Yeah, that's fine.
So on page 207, he says, quote, "Philology, biology, and political economy were established not in the places formerly occupied by general grammar, natural history, and the analysis of wealth, but in an area where those forms of knowledge did not exist, in the space they left blank, in the deep gaps that separated their broad theoretical segments and that were filled with the murmur of the ontological continuum. The objects of knowledge in the 19th century, or the object of knowledge in the 19th century is formed in the very place where the classical plenitude of being has fallen silent." So there's a lot there. But this is, I think this is what his sections that outline the development and history of those particular fields in the classical episteme, like this is what he's been working up to, right? Is that, and this is, we talked about this earlier, right? Where there are greater connections between the discourses in an episteme than between two discourses in separate epistemes, right?
Right.
So let me look back at this quote here. They did not occupy, not in the places formerly occupied by general grammar, natural history, and the analysis of wealth. So biology doesn't just supplant natural history as the new analysis of life or like the next iteration of the analysis of life. And to suggest it did would be like a straightforward, or would claim that the structure of knowledge has been the same.
Yeah.
Right? And just like, oh, we've got an upgrade to biology. Like we've realized that biology is historical.
Yeah.
Or natural history is historical, hence biology.
Yeah.
So not in the places formerly occupied, but in an area where those forms of knowledge did not exist, in the space they left blank. So biology is novel because it's the analysis of life as historical. So that's fundamentally different for Foucault from natural history.
Yeah.
Natural history was the analysis of life as representational.
Right. And this corresponds to the transition from order to history.
Right.
Where
from classical age to 19th century.
Exactly.
So modern.
So in his terms, he says, but we must return, this is on page 238, but we must return in a little more detail to what happened at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, to that too sketchily outlined mutation of order into history, into the fundamental modification of those positivities.
What page was that on?
238. Those positivities which for nearly a century and a half had given place to so many adjacent kinds of knowledge. So, and then the representation, general grammar, natural history, or whatever. And that's the distinct, in the case of natural history, right, he says that it's not as though or this transition did not occur when we started to imbue on nature all the elements of history, or what we think to be historical. It's rather when we started to think about history as being natural, in a sense, when history being that thing that you can't question, right? Like, it's just
right
there. Because order, like, and I just thought of this now, like, order seems like a very, like, a politically charged term, just to think about, authoritarianism or whatever. Like, it seems as though there's a motivation behind it, whereas, obviously that's not the case. But his use of that term is interesting, because I could, probably think of a synonym that would do the job, like just like classification or organization or anything like that. But order is interesting for me. But history is like almost the democratization of that thing, precisely because it becomes our reality, to the point that you can't even recognize it. Like, it's just
you don't
in us.
You don't think order had that closeness in the classical era, and like now it just seems as foreign to us? Like, I think
that's a good point.
I think about like the great naturalists, right? So like Alexander von Humboldt, he's the only one I can think of right off the top of my head, but where, like, of course I'm going to go out into the farthest known lands that haven't been explored yet and take vast catalogs and samples of new species, or new to Europeans species, because I'm trying to determine the order that in which those fit, and like where they fall in the taxonomy of a specific type of plant, so like trees or whatever, right? So like I could see the taking for granted of the world as fundamentally ordered in that age, just as the modern episteme takes history as
right. So, okay.
Granted.
So, you think to whatever would encapsulate, or whatever would signify the use of order in any given episteme, or of any of those ages, is something that would have been, it wasn't necessarily, they weren't aware of it, right? It's not as though we are using or mobilizing this sort of discourse, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit wary of Foucault's claim to not be able to know the episteme you're in. Because, like, if Velázquez didn't know that he was in the episteme of representation, then why did he paint a painting all about representation?
Right. Oh, right? That's interesting, yeah.
I think there's maybe a middle ground there, right? Where, like, you can know the representation is really important in your contemporary moment.
Yeah.
But you might not know it's the condition of the whole episteme, right? Or like you might not have the breadth of sight to see that is like the general mode of knowledge.
Yeah. And okay, that's really interesting, because that makes me think that, okay, and the Marxists might rip their hair out if what I'm about to say, but if we measure one's, because I'm kind of with you there. I don't think that it's just necessarily simply like trying to explain water to a fish, right? Yeah. I think there is something of a cultural logic that seeps in to one's consciousness, right? And I think if we measure, or we don't measure, but there are certain indicators that point to that. And it'd be difficult to say whether or not Velázquez was cognizant of it. If he was like, I am in representation.
Right.
But right. I don't think it necessarily needs to come out in that form. So the way I would understand it is by the fact that existed, and it came to stand in for a whole slew of, or a whole age, is not something to ignore. But then everything else that existed at that time, right? So things that didn't necessarily subscribe by that. So I find it interesting, because Foucault is like quick to say there was that age, and it had all these different characteristics, and I would almost agree with him. But at the same time, we think of what was necessarily excluded.
Right. So, like, to what extent does every discourse within an episteme adhere to the episteme's mode of knowing?
Yeah.
Like, is every discourse within the classical age a discourse of representation?
Yeah, and to
or
what
like
extent
by representation?
To what extent does it require cognizance, like very consciously,
right,
of a thing to throw Foucault's project out of whack, right? Of there to have been someone.
I don't think it requires like self-consciousness in how you do your discourse for Foucault, but
in how you're able to match a certain culture, a certain age.
Yeah,
or
I don't think that.
Really?
I don't think that requires self-consciousness at all.
No. But if such a thing did exist, right? If someone was aware, like they're like, I'm in representation.
Okay, I thought you were saying the opposite.
Because
right, if I knew the episteme that I was in and knew like the condition of knowledge in my episteme is X, if I knew that and furthermore like did something that demonstrated that,
yeah,
I think that like requires a huge amount of self-consciousness.
Right.
And not self-consciousness is the wrong word because that means knowledge of myself.
Yeah,
For
sure.
Foucault, it means knowledge of your whole era.
Yeah, the water around you. But precisely by the fact that there are haves and have-nots, I think points to that, where it seems as though there are examples of people that somehow are closer to that.
So you mean have, like Velasquez is a have, like he has the knowledge of representation?
And this is where perhaps I'd get the Marxists would rip their hair out or something like this, disavowing the kind of lower classes or whatever. But
I don't know. Like I thought what you were saying is, like I said earlier, like, does everything fit and adhere to the episteme? And I think like Foucault's point is just that it has to, in order to exist as knowledge. So maybe you could point to something like alchemy or like witchcraft as something that does not fit in the episteme in which it exists.
Yeah.
Right? So you think of like alchemy practices in I think they would still be around in the classical age, if dying out, where like the symbol you use for an element is connected to the element itself.
Right.
So there is still that link, like the Renaissance link, between sign and signified.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, maybe this would be an interesting thing to attempt to trace the development of, like, you could just pick alchemy from a science, or like what counted as knowledge and as scientific, and how the change in episteme shifted that out of the realm of what counted as knowledge into pseudoscience, or right. So like it's like a vestige of the past episteme.
Yeah. But that then serves a certain function if we were to stick with that kind of Hegelianism thesis, where that serves a certain role, even if it is in opposition to that, a given system or whatever. It's that kind of, it's the antithesis, right? That the system ultimately would subsume or then is then used as like to propel history or whatever, to keep things moving or whatever, precisely as a condition for the realization of your thesis, right? How do you designate thesis? Like, unless we hit the end of history, but I don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah. We're past it.
Yeah, history's gone.
History ended in 1989, 1992? 1992.
For Baudrillard, it was probably like the year 2000 or something.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the shift from the classical episteme to the modern one, if we could. There's just a couple things here I'd want to say.
We should stop there just because
sure.
we're at our hour mark, so we can.
All right.
We'll cut this one off. You know.
Sounds good.
I won't give the whole spiel. You know what to do. But tune in
for the
next one. It'll come up again soon. All right. Thanks, y'all.